Hello. Today we're going to do an oil change, which is a pretty basic routine maintenance process on a motorcycle, but a lot of people are intimidated by anything that has to do with working on their motorcycle. So we're going to demystify it a little bit and show you how easy it is to do. Now, this is my 2005 BMW R1200 GS. So the specific things that I'm going to show you have to do with this bike, but the general concepts about changing your oil are the same whether you ride a BMW or a KTM or a Harley Davidson or a Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, doesn't matter. The concepts are the same. You want to make sure that you have the right oil, go by what your manufacturer tells you. You want to make sure you have a new oil filter, and once again, go by what your manufacturer tells you. Any other parts you might need, you want to make sure you have those ahead of time. In my case, for the BMW, we need a thing called a crush washer, which is just a little one of these guys. The job of the crush washer is to just take up that little bit of extra space between the bottom of the head of the drain bolt and the bottom of the drain pan, the oil pan. So on a BMW, it's something they recommend that you replace every time you change the oil. I go ahead and do that. It's a cheap part. They're 38 cents or 72 cents or whatever. So compared to the cost of the oil and the oil filter, it might as well use it. There's also some tools that we're going to need that are a little bit specific for this bike, but not terribly specific. So you want to make sure you can get your fill port open. So whatever, if you need a tool for that, that's what you need, that tool. You want to make sure you can get your drain plug out. So whatever tool that's required for that. On a BMW, it could be a hex bolt or a hex head or a Torx. So I don't remember exactly which. I think it's a hex on my bike, but that's beside the point. We'll find out what we get once we get in there. And then because my motorcycle has a bash plate underneath the engine, I need to have tools to be able to take the bash plate off. In my case, that means a 13 millimeter hex, a 13 millimeter socket and a 10 millimeter socket. I don't know why they're not all the same, but they're not all the same. There's 3 13s and 1 10, and that's just kind of the way it is. It didn't have the bash plate was not on the bike when I bought it, so I bought all the stock parts from my dealer to put it on there, and that's what came in the kit. Now in my case, I have a special filler cap that goes along with a tool called a dual tool. This is actually a knockoff of the dual tool that came in my Moto Hansa toolkit. It's the same concept, it's the same sizes, it's just made by the Moto Hansa people instead of the people that invented the dual tool. So it works the same way. Oops, you got to set your ratchet to turn the right direction. Righty tighty, lefty loosey. It's a tamper-proof cap. So you want to make sure that you remove your fill cap first, because if you can't get your fill cap off, then you can't get fresh oil into your engine, and that would be bad. Now there's a rubber O-ring that goes in there on this bike, so make sure that anything you take out, you're going to have to put something like it or put it back in. Now this O-ring doesn't need to be replaced every time you change the oil on this bike, but don't lose it because it's important. Now, one tool I forgot to mention is the tool that you use to get the oil filter off. Now you don't put the oil filter on gorilla tight, but because of the heat cycles, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, the seal gets a little bit sealed. Well, I mean, that's the whole point. So using one of these makes getting the old filter off a lot easier. We're going to start by taking off the smaller using the 10 millimeter first. Now, do you need gloves for this? Well, it's usually a good idea to use gloves if you're going to be coming into contact with toxic chemicals. Oil is absolutely a toxic chemical, so you should use gloves. I don't want to get a bunch of angry letters that say, I got skin cancer, because you didn't tell me to use a glove. Now we switch over to the 13. You want a drain pan big enough to hold 4 quarts of oil, because that's what's in the bike. Now, we're going to check this, and oh, that's not it. That's it. Is indeed an 8 millimeter, so we're good there. Okay, so I didn't push the video record button before, and I said all this stuff, and now I'm going to say it again. I'm changing the oil on my engine cold, which is not what they tell you to do. They tell you to get out, run your bike up to operating temperature, and then, wait 5 or 10 minutes so that it cools down and it doesn't sear the flesh off your bones, and then change your oil while the engine is still hot. I rode the bike here about an hour and a half to the shop from Arlington, and it was obviously at operating temperature at that point, and I parked it. That was about 2 weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks. So I'm changing the oil cold. Now, there's 2 reasons why I'm not going to worry about it. The first reason is because changing your oil cold is better than not changing it at all. So don't use the excuse of, I never get a chance to change my oil hot, to not change your oil. My bike's got 85,000 miles on it. The last time I changed the oil was when I did the clutch. No, that's not true. I did it at 80,000 miles when I did a bunch of engine work. I did not have to drain the engine oil to change the clutch. So even though I just put a clutch in it 2,000, 2,500 miles ago, I didn't change the oil at that time. So it's due for an oil change. I do mine every 5,000 miles. So I'm changing it cold. Now, the other reason that I'm not worried about it is because my oil was made, the oil I put in this engine the last time at 80,000 miles was made in, what did you call it earlier? After the Reagan administration. And old oil used to have a material in it called paraffin. Paraffin is a type of wax, which is also a type of oil, but that's a whole other discussion for science people. Paraffin sticks to things when it's cold. So if your engine is cold and you're using a paraffin-based oil, then yes, you are not properly changing your oil. I'm not using a paraffin-based oil, and neither are you. So you don't have to worry about that. You can change your oil cold and not worry about stressing because you're doing something that's going to damage your motorcycle. Change the oil, hot or cold, doesn't matter. Just change it. Now, I also forgot another tool. This is a torque wrench, and you guys know from watching my other videos that I tell you to use a torque wrench. Now, I know the torque of the drain bolt. I'm not going to say it because I want you to look up your own. And yes, there is a torque setting value for the oil filter, but I'm not going to use that at all because I just can't. I go by feel. So I know finger tight and then a half a turn. That's what I've done since the very first vehicle I ever changed the oil on, and that's what I'm going to keep doing on my motorcycle. It's got 85,000 miles on it, and that's what I've done every 5,000 miles when I change the oil since I bought it with 50,000 miles on it. The engine is still running great even though the computer is messed up, so that's what I'm going to keep doing. When you do this, when you pull the drain plug, you want to keep a little bit of upward pressure on it so that you know when it's come all the way out, but the oil doesn't shoot everywhere. Notice I'm wearing the gloves to protect my skin, just in case. Now, since the oil's cold, I'm not super worried about it. If it was hot, I would be really careful because hot engine oil is painful. So we're going to keep a little bit of upward pressure till we feel it come out, and then try to get out of the way as quickly as possible. I can feel it almost at the end. I'm starting to see oil come out. There we go. Okay. So while we're here, we're going to check 2 things. First thing we're going to check is to make sure we got the crush washer off. Okay, and that goes aside because that's going to go in the metal recycling. Then we also want to make sure that we check the end of the drain plug. This is a magnetic drain plug, and you just want to check the end of it for particulate matter. You want to just look at it very carefully. So you check that very carefully, look for gritty stuff on it. You're going to see a little bit of metal, but you don't want to see chunks. Can't get the camera to focus on it, but trust me, it's not chunky. I'm going to take my fresh crush washer, put it on the drain plug, set that aside. I'm going to clean off my drain or my fill plug and the O-ring. And because the engine is cold, it's going to take the oil a little longer to drain out, so I'm just going to let that go. In the meantime, we're going to get the oil filter off. And that's going to be a little more messy. So you want to make sure you get your drain pan positioned under the oil filter. Okay, and now I put that on there, and I don't over tighten them, and you could see how tight that was. So spin that off. Again, keep upward pressure on it until you feel it come all the way loose. You're just going to drop it in this 4 quarts of oil, and that's going to be hugely messy. Flip it over, let it drain. I'm going to go put this where we keep the oil so that it drains properly. I'm making a giant mess here. Okay, while this drains, we're just going to let it drain for, I'm going to leave it for about 10 minutes and then come back to this. So for you, it'll be a split second. In the real world, it'll be about 10 or 15 minutes. So see you soon. Okay, so this has been draining for about 10 or 15 minutes. The dripping has slowed to a very slow crawl. Fresh gloves. Gloves are cheap, skin is expensive, so. Now, one of the things you want to do is clean out the housing where your oil filter is. You just want to wipe it out so that there's no oil in there. So that's what we're going to do. Then wipe off the area around where the filler or where the drain plug goes as well. So this is the fresh oil filter, and you see it's got a rubber ring on there. So there's 2 things you want to do before you put that on. Grab yourself a flashlight and point it up at where the thing goes, the oil filter. Look to make sure you got the old rubber ring off. And while you're there, check the threads on the mount point to make sure that nothing's bunged up. You don't want to cross thread your oil filter. So you want to make sure that everything looks good. Now, I'm one of those people that says you should put a little bit of oil in your oil filter before you put it on. You don't have to, but you're going to put fresh oil in from the top of the engine, and your oil filter's on the bottom of the engine. So if you leave it dry, then it's got to fill all the way up before that oil starts circulating through your engine. So from my perspective, it doesn't take but a second to put a little oil in it and fill it halfway up, 2/3 of the way up, whatever. And it just keeps everything going a little more quickly inside the engine. So hang on just a second while we do that. That'll make it a little easier to see what we're doing. So even though this container says Valvoline, you saw me get it out of the bulk can, the 55-gallon drum. That's a BMW Motorrad Group Avantech 15W50 oil, which is not the original spec for this bike, but that's what I put in it because it's January. So let that bubble down just a little bit. And that's really all you need to do. Just get a little bit in there so that it's not completely dry. That's all you got to do. Now, once it's settled, you want to take a little bit of that fresh oil, get it on your finger, and go around the rubber sealing ring a couple times. And then you're going to gently it takes a little more coordination than you think because your fingers are slippery. But once it starts to bite on the threads, then you're good. Wipe your greasy fingers, oily fingers off, because there's a difference between oil and grease. And get that on there finger tight. Now, I told you before that you can torque it if you want to, but I do finger tight plus a half a turn, and that's what I'm going to do. Finger tight plus half a turn. Now I've got my drain plug with the fresh crush washer on it. So that's going to go in. And that will get torqued. Now, I looked up the torque value, so I'm not going to tell you what it is, because you need to look that up for your motorcycle on your own. Now, don't put the bash plate on. Don't put your bike back on the ground if you're using a lift. We're going to put a little bit of oil in it and make sure the oil goes in okay. Then we're going to put the bash plate back on. Now, unfortunately, my battery's dead, so I don't know if we can start it to do the critical last step, but we may have to jump it. We'll see what happens. Normally at this point you would start the bike and check underneath to see if there's any oil leaking. That's why I put the bash plate on the lift under it. So the bash plate is relatively clean. I could clean it, but it's definitely dry. So if any oil was to start leaking out, I would see it right away and I would know to turn the bike off, make sure that the oil filter and the drain plug were tight, torqued properly if that's what you do, and you always torque your drain plug. But my battery is dead, and it's going to take a couple of days to charge it up enough to be able to start the bike. So I'm going to put the bash plate back on. I've done this a lot, so I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to have any oil leaks. But it's always best to check. So even though I'm not checking this time, I always recommend that you check, and normally I would. So I'll be keeping an eye on it when I first start it up after the battery comes back to life. And so we're going to put the bash plate back on. The wrong direction. There we go. Now these, there are torque values for these. This is one of the times where I tell you, just go by the feel. Just tighten them until they're nice and snug, because these back ones are rubber mounted. So they need to be able to move just a little bit if you actually hit something. The front ones are connected to spindles. And once again, they just need to be good and snug, good and tight. That one's rubber mounted. You can feel it give. It tightens and then it springs back, see? All right. So that's it for changing the oil. It is not as intimidating as you think it is, and you can do it. I promise you, you can do it. Pay attention, go slow, stick to the details, make sure you have all your tools and parts before you start. Take your fill plug out first, then the drain plug. Otherwise, you have to turn your bike all the way upside down to get all the oil out of the drain or the fill plug hole, and that's just inconvenient. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, hit the little bell so you know when there's a new video up, and check out our other channels. We got Motorcycle Test Kitchen right here on YouTube, and we got 2 podcasts going. Chasing the Horizon, which is about the motorcycle industry in general, and 200 Miles Before Breakfast, which is about the members of the BMW Motorcycle Owners of America. Take it easy, and thanks for watching. And don't forget to recycle the packaging that your parts come in. Now the yellow light is blinking.
Yeah, that means it's testing the battery. It should not be in testing state yet.
So is that good or bad?
That's bad.
That's bad.
It's already on the charge state.
Oh, so I definitely need a new battery, huh? Come down here, look at the camera. Say goodbye, George.
Y'all come back now, you hear?